Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us, because today we are tackling what is arguably the most frustrating, head-scratching economic mystery of the whole post-pandemic era. We're going to look at some wild data that actually reconciles the totally confusing economy we've all been living in. I mean, if you've checked your bank account lately and felt a massive disconnect between what the headlines say and how your wallet actually feels, trust me, you are absolutely not alone.
Let's start with a feeling pretty much all of us share. Survey data from the Pew Research Center consistently shows that people view inflation as one of the absolute worst problems facing the United States right now. And honestly, yeah, we all know this. It's been a total nightmare, right? It feels like every single time you hit the grocery store or pay a utility bill, a little bit more of your hard-earned money has just vanished into thin air. The financial pain, the anxiety, it's all very real, and this survey data hits the nail on the head, validating exactly what we've been experiencing on the ground.
But, okay, here is where we hit the central mystery of our explainer. When we zoom out and look at the broad macroeconomic data, nominal wages across the country actually went up during this exact same period. So I really want you to ask yourself, if wages went up, why on earth do we still feel poorer? How can this widespread, totally palpable financial anxiety coexist with data that literally says our paychecks are getting bigger? Well, that is exactly the paradox we're solving today.
Okay, let's dive right into this using some really fantastic research from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. They recently put out a massive, comprehensive study looking at post-pandemic inflation and wage growth dynamics. Essentially, they pitted the strict mathematical data right up against our everyday, on-the-ground reality to figure out who actually came out ahead and who fell behind. Now, before we get into the winners and losers here, let's do a quick recap of the chronological roller coaster of the inflation rate just to set the stage. Back in April of 2020, right at the onset of the pandemic, inflation was sitting at practically 0%. But then it began this incredibly steep climb, eventually peaking at a staggering 9% in June of 2022. Thankfully, after a period of cooling down, it settled back to around 3% in early 2024. But man, that peak in 2022, that was the highest we've seen in over 40 years.
So, how did different income brackets experience that exact same roller coaster? Well, the Cleveland Fed broke it all down by income, adjusting for household size. And what they found was that the bottom 40% of earners actually faced higher inflation than the top 20%. The reason? It makes sense when you think about it. Lower income households spend a much larger chunk of their income on basic necessities, things like food and housing, which obviously saw massive price spikes. But, and this is a huge, bold, underlined but, that exact same bottom 40% experienced way higher, more robust wage growth compared to the median.
And that brings us to a really counterintuitive conclusion. When you take the inflation they experienced and subtract it from the wage growth they actually achieved, purchasing power went up across the board. By the end of 2024, the bottom 40% were ahead of inflation by 4.5 percentage points since 2019. The top 20%? They came out ahead too, by a slightly lower 3.5 percentage points. So, purely mathematically speaking, the data is telling us that the average worker actually beat inflation.
Now, if you're sitting there scratching your head right now, trust me, I am right there with you. If the math looks so great, why does it feel so awful? That cognitive dissonance you're feeling is 100% valid. It is incredibly exhausting to be told by a spreadsheet that everything is fine when it clearly doesn't feel fine. To make sense of this, we need to step away from the dry macroeconomic numbers from the Cleveland Fed and look at the very human behavioral side of economics.
To do exactly that, we're bringing in a brilliant working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's titled, super appropriately, Why Do Workers Dislike Inflation? For this study, researchers surveyed 3,000 U.S. workers in early 2024 to figure out exactly how people respond when prices rise. And let me tell you, this paper holds the absolute key to solving our paradox. The researchers introduced two incredibly important concepts here, and they give us the exact vocabulary we need to describe our everyday financial stress. The first concept is wage erosion. Basically, this is the idea that if you do absolutely nothing, inflation just naturally eats away at the real spending value of your paycheck. The second concept is conflict costs. This is the hidden behavioral toll, the sheer stress of actually having to fight to get your paycheck to catch up with the rising cost of living. Because let's face the harsh reality, employers generally do not just automatically adjust your pay for inflation out of the goodness of their hearts. If you want to catch up, you have to take real-world stressful actions.
We're talking about initiating those highly uncomfortable, tough conversations with your boss. You know, the ones that keep you staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m. It means organizing or going through intense union negotiations. Or it means spending massive amounts of time and energy soliciting competing job offers just to force your current employer's hand. These actions are risky, they're stressful, and they are deeply uncomfortable.
Now, what's really fascinating is exactly how much we absolutely hate that stress. When you look at the survey data, a massive 79% of respondents simply accepted their employer's default wage offer in 2023. Nearly 4 out of 5 workers avoided the conflict entirely. Only 21% actually bit the bullet and took those costly, stressful actions to fight for a higher wage.
But as you might guess, avoiding that conflict comes at a really severe price. The survey revealed just how little employers will raise pay voluntarily. If a worker doesn't put up a fight, employers only index wages by a tiny 0.05% for every 1% increase in inflation. I mean, that is virtually nothing. It completely proves that workers absolutely have to initiate conflict if they want to survive a major inflationary shock without mathematically becoming poorer.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real financial outcomes of that choice. The data shows that fighting actually works. Workers who initiated conflict saw a median wage growth of 3% over what was originally offered to them. Meanwhile, the folks who just accepted the default offer effectively left a 2% median raise sitting right there on the table. They knew they probably could have gotten more, but the mere thought of the conflict was just way too high of a barrier.
Which brings us to the massive aha moment of this whole explainer. The researchers found that, in the grand scheme of things, wage catch-up does not actually raise a worker's overall welfare. Sure, you might mathematically beat inflation by fighting for that raise, just like we saw in the Cleveland Fed data earlier. But the extra money you gain, it is essentially canceled out by the intense mental and behavioral costs of the conflict itself. You might have more dollars in your pocket, but your overall well-being hasn't improved at all simply because the fight completely drained you.
So the absolutely crucial point boils down to one very specific number: 1.75%. Based on all the survey data, the researchers calculated that the median worker is willing to sacrifice exactly 1.75% of their wages just to avoid having conflict with their employer. Think about that for a second. That is the quantifiable, monetary value of our aversion to having a tough conversation about money.
Okay, let's put this all together to see the true cycle of inflation from the worker's perspective. Step 1, inflation spikes, just like it did in 2022. Step 2, because employers don't automatically match it, real wages immediately fall. That's the wage erosion we talked about. And finally, step 3. To fix it, workers are forced to initiate painful, exhausting conflict to catch up. It is a constant, mandatory battle just to maintain the absolute status quo of your purchasing power.
So, to conclude our core argument today, standard economic models that only track real wages deeply underestimate the true human cost of inflation. They tell us we're making more money, so hey, we should be happy. But they completely ignore those conflict costs. The true cost of inflation isn't just mathematical, it is deeply behavioral. It's the stress. It's the job interviews you really didn't want to do. It's those incredibly tense meetings with HR.
I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on long after this explainer finishes. Knowing the true behavioral cost of an economy in flux, ask yourself, would you take a 1.75% pay cut today just to avoid a tough, awkward conversation with your boss tomorrow? Understanding your own personal conflict cost changes exactly how you view your paycheck, and it explains exactly why inflation hurts quite so much. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep learning.